dissect the flag. So the flag has a royal blue background that represents the squadron of the Royal Navy, and the Union flag in the corner is because it used to be part of the British Empire, where Queen Elizabeth is still head of state to this day, and New Zealand is part of the Commonwealth. So the stars represents the asterism within the constellation of the Crux, the Southern Cross. So the absolute location of New Zealand is 40.9 degrees south and 174.8 degrees east. The relative location is south of the Pacific Ocean and southeast of Australia, surrounded by the Tasman Sea. The neighboring countries are Australia, Tonga, and Fiji. However, none of the countries actually border New Zealand, considering it's surrounded by the Tasman Sea. So the origin of New Zealand, it was actually part of the British Empire, but it doesn't actually have an independence day because it earned its independence slowly over time in small steps. And Queen Elizabeth, as said before, is head state. So pretty much New Zealand is independent in every other aspect. So the capital of New Zealand is Wellington, and the major city is Auckland, which has a population of 1.5 million people. And the four major international airports are Auckland Airport, Wellington Airport, Christchurch, and Queenstown. So New Zealand's territorial disputes are Atafu, Whakaofo, Nuku'alofa, and Swains Islands. And New Zealand is part of the Oceanic region, and it's not actually part of a continent, but the Oceanic region contains the Australian continent as well as the islands surrounding it. New Zealand's divided into the North Island and the South Island. The North Island is Te Ika a Maui, and the South Island is called Te Waiponamu. New Zealand is a small nation island with 4.5 million people, and the Dutch explorer named Abel Tasman found it and called it Statenland, and then in 1645 the Dutch cartographer named it Nova Zealandia, and now it's called New Zealand. So New Zealand is a developed country, and it has two main time zones, which is New Zealand Standard Time and the Chapman Island Standard Time, which is both 45 minutes apart. And now moving on to demographics.
Alright, for the demographics session, ethnicity breakdown. The majority of the population is European, being made up of 71.2%. 14.1% are Maori, 11.3% are Asian, 7.6% are Pacific peoples, Middle Eastern, and Latin Americans, and then the remaining 8.3% is other ethnicities. So religions. It is mainly Christian, with some Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam in the country as well. The country is not really in any issues at the moment. Tourism in New Zealand is definitely allowed, and its official language is English.
Although New Zealand is isolationist in terms of international issues, it does have a lot of allies. Its closest allies by far are the UK, Australia, and the United States. Both Australia and the US were involved with New Zealand in the ANZUS Pact, which provided mutual defense. However, in 1983, when New Zealand banned all nuclear-powered ships from their ports, which included US ships and US military ships, the US pulled their alliance from the New Zealanders and made it so that they did not have to protect them in terms of war. Basically, this made the alliance obsolete since it was only Australia and the US. Trading partners. The biggest trading partners of New Zealand are China, Australia, the USA, Japan, and South Korea, respectively. New Zealand is isolationist in terms of fighting in foreign conflict. One of the most major conflicts it fought in was in World War II, because it was afraid of being invaded by the Japanese, like Guam and other Pacific islands. Also, although it condemned the invasion of Iraq by the US, it did send a few frigates and a P-3 Orion plane to assist. They also assisted with anti-terrorism efforts in Afghanistan, but pulled all troops out by 2013.
Our first news. Students left stranded by the immigration's lack of oversight. The legal process that makes it possible to racially discriminate in decision-making needs to be investigated. Immigration began advising the minister that its strategy to clamp down on immigrant exploration was to target those immigrants who are at risk of exploration, to deport people who may become victims rather than stop the exploration itself. Immigration has become suggested that the budget constraints were responsible for this strategy. It began a campaign of advising the minister that problems in the Indian students' markets were the fault of the students themselves for exploring pathways to residence. So immigration officers were left in no doubt that Indian students were the target, and this can be seen in immigration's briefing papers to the minister. Officers have absolute discrimination in decision making. This means they can simply decline an applicant because they choose not to believe an applicant or trust a document or accept the fact value a statement that has been made. Basically, decision-making based on assumptions rather than facts. While some decisions were previously able to be overturned in the complaint process from May 2017 onwards, this right was taken away by the new complaint process. This gave immigration officers the ability to discriminate against applicants of particular nationalities without tainting the immigration records by reference to the applicant's nationality. It also enabled immigration to have plausible deniability when questioned. Other avenues of complaint are also unavailable. A declined visa turns an applicant into an overstayer, have no income, and are unable to afford any legal challenge in the courts. While immigration instructions do not require immigrants to abide by principles set out in the tribunal decisions, it is the tribunal continuance to point that the immigrants are making the same mistakes in their assessments. A responsive ministry should obviously correct those mistakes and amend its process accordingly. However, immigration has taken the opposite approach over the past years and now makes it clear that its decision that is not required to follow the principles of the policy interpreted by the decision making. They are also entitled to ignore the tribunal's criticism in its decision making. This removes another key check and balance in immigration decision making, which inevitably leads to the discrimination decision making. Those students who choose to stay in flight must do as an overstayer, work under the table, and become even more vulnerable explanation. Rather than addressing the exploration problem, is simply contributing to the driving background. The very explicitity of the system that has been developed also enables the immigration to avoid media secrecy. Administrative principles of fairness and natural justice are a fundamental common law protecting against discrimination decision-making. Our second current news is China and Russia could be looking for a backdoor to Western intelligence through the soft underbelly of New Zealand. New Zealand is the soft underbelly of an international intelligence sharing alliance, which may make it vulnerable to China and Russia, according to a report by Canada's intelligence agency. Both New Zealand and Canada, as well as the US, UK, and Australia, are part of the Five Eyes Alliance, which has routinely shared sensitive intelligence since 1955. But on the topic of foreign interference, a report from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, places the spotlight solely on New Zealand. Extricating New Zealand from these military groupings and away from the traditional partners would be a major cope with the excise government's strategic goal of turning China into a global great power. It recently emerged that the ex-CIA China expert recommended that the Five Eyes re-evaluated New Zealand's membership for failing to adequately respond to political interference from the Chinese Communist Party. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern told Business Insider that she has certainly not had any indication that our Five Eyes membership in the arrangement is under question, nor have I ever heard that it has been raised with any of my colleagues. Attention to China's foreign influence activities has put New Zealand's government in an awkward position, according to the report. Our final news. New Zealand cites climate change is banning new offshore drilling. New Zealand will stop issue permits for the offshore oil and gas explorations as it is moving to combat climate change. They will be forced to rely on more expensive imports. It provoked bitter responses from the petroleum industry. New Zealand is committed to the new goal of becoming a net zero emissions economy by 2050. It would allow the extensive 22 active offshore permits covering more than 38,000 square miles to run until their expiration date. No jobs will be lost in this process. New Zealand's government aims to increase the value of New Zealand's petroleum exports.
I'd say New Zealand's population is bent out of sheep. I'd still pay Zealand dollars to get there. It gets my seal of approval. The sites there, they could paint a zillion words. Man, these puns are cueing me. I'm Carly Zeus, Geography 10.